So it's a pleasure to be here today. I love being around PMs and designers and product people. You're my kind of people. So I am thrilled today to talk about habit-forming products, how we can design for higher user engagement, because we've all seen over the past several years that these devices that we're carrying around with us in our pockets have a profound impact on our day-to-day lives. And so the question that I started my research wondering was, how do these companies do it? Right? How do companies like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and WhatsApp and Slack and Snapchat, both in the enterprise world as well as the consumer space, how do they keep people coming back? You know, if you want to get really good at something, you should find the best in the business, right? Let's say you wanted to be a competitive swimmer. Maybe you'd give Michael Phelps a call. If you wanted to be a fantastic investor, maybe you would see if Warren Buffett could give you some advice. If you wanted to be an actor, you might call Keanu Reeves and see what... You guys awake here? All right, just testing you. So, so how do we figure out, how we learn from the best in the business to figure out how to make our products and services more engaging, more habit-forming? And so we want to try and look at these patterns behind some of the best in the business. Now, I took what I learned over the past 5 years or so, and I put it into this book, Hooked: How to Build Habit-Forming Products. There's a lot in this book that I cannot cover today, unfortunately. I only have 25 minutes, and I want to save plenty of time for Q&A. But you know, the book is, I think, $12 on Amazon. If you don't have $12, I'll tell you where you can pirate it on the web. That's fine, too. I don't care. Just get the book, do the exercise. There's a lot more than we can cover today in the book. Just so that we kind of set the groundwork, let's define what we mean by a habit. A habit is a behavior done with little or no conscious thought. It's about half of what you do every single day, day in and day out, is done purely out of habit. These behaviors done with little or no conscious thought. And I believe that the people in this room are the people who can change habits for good. And I'm not alone. Because there is an explosion of companies today who are using the psychology of habit-forming products to help people build happier, better, more productive lives. Right? So these techniques that I'm showing you today, I don't teach these techniques so that Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and WhatsApp can learn these techniques. I teach these techniques so that everybody else, the world over, can design the kind of products that are just as sticky and engaging and the kind of products that people want to use, but to date aren't used because they're designed without thinking about consumer psychology tenets. So that's what I want to share with you today, is what can we learn from these companies to help build our own habit-forming products to improve our customers' lives. What I found in my research was that all of these products that I just talked about, at their core, embedded in the user experience, is what I call a hook. A hook is an experience designed to connect the user's problem with your product, with your solution, with enough frequency to form a habit. Let me say that again. A hook is an experience designed to connect the user's problem with your product with enough frequency to form a habit. Now, these hooks have 4 basic parts. Okay? A hook starts with a trigger to an action, then to a reward, and finally an investment. And it's through successive cycles through these hooks that customer habits are formed, that our tastes are shaped, and that we begin to form these routines with the products we use. So we're going to walk through these 4 basic steps of a hook. Every hook starts with a trigger. Now, there are 2 types of triggers. The first trigger you'll be very familiar with. These are called external triggers. External triggers are things in our environment that tell us what to do next. Click here, buy now, play this. A friend through word of mouth telling you about this great new app you should try out. All examples of external triggers. Now, we in the product designer community, we know all about external triggers. This is our craft. This is our trade. We deal with these things every single day. But what we don't think about enough is the second type of trigger. These are called internal triggers. Internal triggers are things that tell us what to do next, but where the information for what to do is stored as a memory or an association inside the user's head. So what we do when we're in a particular place, a certain situation, when we're in a particular routine around certain people, and most frequently when we experience certain emotions, tells us what to do next. Now, not just any emotions, specifically negative emotions. Negative emotions are the most frequently occurring internal triggers. What we do when we're feeling bored or lonely or lost or dissatisfied or discouraged, whatever, when we experience these negative emotions, this is when we are prompted to action. Now, if you don't believe me, there was a great study done a few years ago that found that people suffering from depression check email more. I just saw like 3 people put away their phones. Why do people suffering from clinical depression check email more? Well, it turned out what these researchers found is that people suffering from depression experience what psychologists call negative valence states. They feel down more frequently than the rest of the population. So what are they doing to boost their mood, to be taken out of those negative valence states? They're going online, they're checking their devices, they're looking at email more often than the rest of the population. And if we're honest with ourselves, we all do this, right? We all do this. Listen, there is only one reason and one reason only that you use any product or service, and that one reason is to modulate your mood, to make you feel something different. Let me ask you, what website or app do we check when we're feeling lonely? Where do we go? Facebook, right? And somebody said Tinder, I think. Is that... It's a different kind of loneliness, but it's true, okay? What about when we're feeling unsure about something? Before we scan our brains to see if we know the answer, what are we doing? We're Googling it. And what do we do when we're feeling bored? You know, between 2 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you have that big project you don't want to work on right now. Where do you go? You go to BuzzFeed, you go to YouTube, you check stock prices, you look at sports scores, you see what stupid thing Trump said today in the news. All of these things cater to this painful internal trigger of boredom. We don't like that sensation of boredom, and to be taken out of that negative valence state, we use these tools, we use these devices, we check these apps with little or no conscious thought. Okay? So how do we use this for good, right? I told you that you could use these products to help build healthy habits in your users' lives. How do we do that? It starts by fundamentally answering this question of knowing your customer's internal trigger. It is absolutely critical that you can define the emotion, okay, the pain point, boredom, loneliness, fatigue, whatever it might be, and know when it occurs in your user's life. Okay? I'll tell you a very quick story. I was just on a transcon flight, and I was sitting in the aisle, and across from me was a gentleman who was sleeping. And the flight attendant rolled up with the cart, and she says to the gentleman, she says, "Sir," he's sleeping, right? He's got his blanket pulled up. He's clearly not conscious. And she says a little louder, a second time, she says, "Sir." Still doesn't wake up. Finally, she kind of raises her voice. She says, "Sir." And he wakes up. He says, "What? And she says, "What would you like to drink, sir?" Sounds crazy, right? But we do this to our customers all the time, right? We throw external triggers at them, notifications, messages on our schedule without thinking about when they might have the internal trigger where they might actually need the product. We don't consider their schedule. The difference between an external trigger, a notification, an email, whatever, that feels like spam, and one that feels like magic is one word. And that word is context. Context is the distance between the internal trigger and the external trigger. The closer together you can couple those two things, the minute I feel that internal trigger with the moment you deliver me the external trigger, the more likely it is that I will respond. Okay? But you can't do that unless you understand what the customer's internal trigger is and when it occurs in their life. Okay, the next step of the hook is the action phase. The action phase is defined as the simplest behavior done in anticipation of a reward. The very simplest little teeny tiny behavior the user can do to get relief from that discomfort, from that internal trigger. Let me show you a few examples. Scrolling on Pinterest, a quick search on Google, or just simply pushing the play button on YouTube. These incredibly simple, discrete behaviors that give immediate relief to that discomfort, to that internal trigger. Now, there's a formula that helps us predict the likelihood of these singular behaviors. It comes from a researcher at Stanford by the name of B.J. Fogg. Has anybody seen this before? Who's seen this before? Oh, not as many. Okay, good. This is a very helpful formula in a product development context. If you're trying to figure out why aren't people pushing this button, why aren't they doing the behavior we want them to do, if for whatever reason users are not acting the way you would expect them to, there are only 3 reasons. Either they lack motivation, that's the M, they lack ability, that's the A. Ability is how easy or difficult something is to do. Or the trigger isn't present. We just talked all about triggers. Okay? So for every human behavior, we always require sufficient motivation, sufficient ability, and a trigger. We can actually plot this on a graph and see what's missing. Because for every single behavior, if we lack sufficient motivation, or if we lack sufficient ability, so if something is easy to do, it's over here. If something is hard to do, it's over here. We don't cross this red threshold, right? If we stay in this red zone, no matter how many triggers we throw at people, the behavior will not occur. Okay? If they're not sufficiently motivated or they lack ability, if it's not easy enough to do. However, when the user has sufficient motivation or the ability is easy enough to do, when the trigger is present, the behavior will occur every single time. Online, offline, your behavior, your spouse's behavior, your children's behavior, your customer's behavior always needs to have these three basic elements at the same time for any behavior to occur. Okay? There's a lot more science and research and examples in the book, but I'm running out of time, so I want to move out to the next step of the hook, the reward phase. The reward phase is where the user's itch is scratched. And to understand rewards, we have to understand the brain. And in particular, an area of the brain that is called the nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens was first studied by two Canadian researchers by the name of Olds and Milner. And Olds and Milner discovered that this part of the brain had some very peculiar qualities. In their experiments, they implanted electrodes inside the brains of lab animals, and then they allowed these lab animals to push on a little lever that sent an electrical stimulation to their nucleus accumbens. What they found was that these lab animals couldn't get enough of pressing on this lever. They would run across painful electrified grids. They would forgo food and water just to continue to stimulate this part of the brain again and again. In later experiments done on people, they observed similar results. That when people were given a little button to press on, and every time they pressed on this button, they would receive a jolt to their nucleus accumbens. They did so hundreds of times. Now, the good news is we don't need electrodes in people's brains to stimulate their nucleus accumbens because your nucleus accumbens is activated every single day with things like luxury goods, junk food, sex, certain chemicals, and of course, our technology. All of these stimulate the very same part of the brain. Now, for decades, the psychology community believed that the purpose of the nucleus accumbens was to stimulate pleasure. We still hear it today. People talk about dopamine hits and dopamine squirts. That's complete rubbish. Turns out that's not how the brain stimulates us to action. It's not that we seek to feel good per se. It's that the brain stimulates what's called the stress of desire. That's what makes us act. It's all about anticipation, and let me show you why. The nucleus accumbens becomes most active in anticipation of the reward, as you can see from this fMRI study. But then when people got the thing they wanted, the thing that was supposed to make them feel good and finally make them happy, that's when the nucleus accumbens becomes less active. So the way the brain gets us to act is not by making us feel good, per se. It's by creating this desirous response, this wanting, this craving reflex. And I can teach you how to supercharge that reflex. Did you know that I can tell you a way to manufacture desire? Does anybody here want to know how to manufacture desire? I'm doing it to you right now. So by taking that long pause and making you wait for a minute and asking you a question, some of you started thinking, hey, why did this guy stop talking? What's he going to do next? Does he even know the answer? And that bit of mystery, that uncertainty, causes you to engage, it causes you to focus, and it is highly habit-forming. The unknown is fascinating. We call this variable rewards. This comes out of the classic work of B.F. Skinner, the father of operant conditioning. Skinner took these pigeons, he put them in a little box, and in the box he put a little disc that the pigeons could peck at. And every time they pecked at the disc, they would receive a little reward, a little food pellet. And what Skinner observed was that very quickly, by giving a food pellet every time the pigeon pecked at the disc, he could train them to do it on command, right? Whenever the pigeon felt hungry, by the way, this experiment didn't work if there was no internal trigger of hunger, but whenever the pigeon felt hungry, they would peck at the disc. Great, that's called operant conditioning. But then Skinner had a little problem. He started running out of these little food pellets. He didn't have enough to go around to give a pigeon every time, so he started giving them a pellet once in a while. So sometimes the pigeon would peck at the disc, no reward. The next time the pigeon would peck at the disc, they would receive a food pellet. And here's what Skinner observed, that the rate of response, the number of times that these pigeons pecked at the disc, increased when the reward was given on a variable schedule of reinforcement. Why does this happen? Because variability spikes activity in the nucleus accumbens, creating this desirous response, this wanting reflex. And so in all sorts of products that you find most engaging, most habit-forming, you will find one or more of these three types of variable rewards. Let me introduce these to you briefly. Rewards of the tribe are things that feel good, that come from other people, and have this element of mystery, this bit of variability. So if you think about empathetic joy, feeling good because someone else feels good, partnership, cooperation, competition, all of these things feel good, come from other people, and have this element of mystery and variability. Best example online, of course, is social media. When you open up the Facebook app or check your news feed, you're never quite sure what you're going to see. Right? What photos might you find? What videos might you see? What are the comments going to say? How many likes does something get? High degree of social variability. We see this also, by the way, in the enterprise space. If you think about a product like Stack Overflow or Slack, same principles are at work. The next type of variable rewards is rewards of the hunt, the search for resources. Right? This comes from our human nature to search for material possessions. In modern society, we buy these things with money and information. So when people think of variable rewards, the classic example is the Las Vegas casino, right? Where you play these games of chance because it's interesting to know what's going to happen next, right? Nobody stops watching a turning slot machine wheel, right? We want to know what's going to happen next. We see the exact same dynamic, the exact same psychology at work online. Consider the feed. Have you wondered why is it that everything today online, especially on mobile devices, everything seems to have a feed these days, right? Why is that? Well, let's take a look at LinkedIn, for example. When I open up the LinkedIn app, it used to be this resume app, no longer, right? Now it's a content company that Microsoft for what, $30 billion? When you open up the LinkedIn app, you see these stories, right? This interesting content. And maybe the first one's interesting, maybe the second one's interesting, but maybe the third one's interesting. So how do you keep seeing more content? What do you have to do? What's the action? What's the habit to see more interesting content? You scroll. Exactly. And that's scrolling and scrolling, searching for more interesting content, use the exact same psychology as pulling on a slot machine. Both variable rewards of the hunt, searching and searching for that next interesting bit of information. And finally, rewards of the self. Rewards of the self are things that feel good, that have this element of variability, but don't come from other people and aren't about the search for rewards from material rewards or information rewards. These are things that feel good in and of themselves. They're intrinsically pleasurable. So the search for competency, mastery, consistency, and control. Best example online is gameplay. So when people play Dots or Angry Birds or Candy Crush or any number of these other games, you're not necessarily winning anything in terms of material possessions. You're not necessarily even playing with other people, right? But there's something fun about getting to the next level, the next accomplishment, the next achievement. Now, even if you say to yourself, look, I'm a serious business person, I don't play these silly games, I bet you play this game every day. Does this look familiar? Clearing those unread messages in your inbox, finishing the to-dos on your to-do list, or the thing that always gets me is that one app notification that I have to open so I can clear it away, are all examples of that reward of the self, the search for mastery, consistency, competency, and control. The point of the variable reward phase is to give users what they came for, to scratch their itch, but leave a bit of mystery around what they might find the next time they engage with the product. Now, something that I didn't put in the book, but I kind of chewed on afterwards, is that not every product wants to insert variability. Okay, let me be very clear there. Not every product needs to insert variability. For example, Google doesn't want to make your search results more variable. Uber doesn't want your Uber driver to go around town to increase the variability of your arrival time. That doesn't make any sense, right? But in those situations, they operate in an inherently variable situation. Okay? And in those circumstances where you already have variability, such as where is the thing I'm looking for on the web, or when is my ride going to arrive, and can I get to where I'm going on time, in those situations, you want to give the user greater agency and control over something that's already variable. Okay, so in some circumstances, we want to increase variability if it's something that, for example, the user is coming to be entertained. But in other circumstances, we want to give the user greater agency and control over something that's already variable. Make sense? Okay, now finally, the last step of the hook, and probably the most overlooked of the 4 steps of the hook, is the investment phase. The investment phase is where the user puts something into the product in anticipation of a future benefit, some kind of future reward. And there are 2 ways that users can invest in the product, because the point of the investment phase is to increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook. So there's 2 ways products do this. The first way that users invest in a product to increase the likelihood of the next pass is by loading the next trigger. Anytime the user does something to increase the likelihood of the next pass on their own accord, something that I did to bring myself back, that's called loading the next trigger. For example, when you send someone a message on WhatsApp or Slack or any number of other messaging services, when you invest in the platform by sending someone that message, there's no immediate reward, right? You don't get any points, there's no badges, there's no leaderboard. What are you anticipating will happen? Well, when you load the next trigger by sending someone a message, you're likely to get a reply. And that reply comes coupled with, what's this meatball an example of? That's an external trigger prompting you through the hook once again. Okay, so it's not some piece of spammy marketing that you sent me. It's something that I did on my own to bring myself back. That's the first way that investments increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook. The second way is by storing value. Now, storing value is a really big deal. This is why I love working in technology as opposed to working in industries that sell physical goods, right? Because physical goods, everything in the physical world, everything made out of atoms, this podium, my clothing, your chairs here, everything in the physical world loses value with wear and tear, right? It depreciates. But habit-forming technology should do the opposite. Habit-forming products appreciate with use. They should get better and better the more we use them. And they do this because of this principle of stored value. Let me show you a few examples. The more content you give to a site, for example, the more content I upload to Google Drive, the more it becomes my one and only cloud storage solution. It becomes more valuable the more content I upload. The more data I give to a service, so for example, Mint.com, the more data, financial data they have about me, the more I can do with the product. Right? If you think about this in the case of a social network, for example, like Facebook, they are customizing the product in real time based on my data. So if you logged into my Facebook account or Pinterest account, it'd be boring for you, right? Because I'm co-creating that product based on the data I am investing in the service. Followers are a form of investment because the more followers someone has, the better the product becomes a way to reach their audience. Think about it. If tomorrow Twitter said, hey, we're shutting down Twitter unless you pay us. Twitter's no longer free. Who's more likely to cut Twitter a check? Is it going to be someone with 10 followers or 10,000 followers? Of course, it's going to be the person with 10,000 followers because they've stored all this value in the form of their follower count. And finally, reputation. Reputation is a form of stored value that users can literally take to the bank. Because my reputation on Upwork or eBay or Airbnb dictates how much I can charge for my goods and services. And how likely am I to leave one of these platforms after I've accrued this positive reputation? Right? It's kind of hard to leave. It's kind of sticky now. Even if a better product or service comes along. Let me tell you a cold hard truth they never teach you. Is that it is a myth. It's a lie that the best product wins. That is not true. Silicon Valley and Silicon Alley graveyards are full of companies that had the best technology. It's not the best technology that wins. It's the product that can capture the monopoly of the mind, the product that we turn to first with little or no conscious thought that carries the market. It's the products that can take users through these 4 basic steps of a trigger, action, reward, and investment through cycles, changing user preferences, informing their tastes, and creating these habits. So if you're making the kind of product that requires repeat engagement, that you need customers to come back to on their own, without spammy advertising and messaging, etc., but on their own, prompted internally, well, you've got to ask yourself for these 5 fundamental questions of, number 1, what's the internal trigger that your product is addressing? Number 2, what's the external trigger that prompts your user to take the key behavior? Number 3 here, what's the simplest behavior done in anticipation of a reward? Is the reward fulfilling and yet leaves the user wanting more? And then finally, what's the bit of work that the user does to increase their likelihood of the next pass through the hook? Now, before I jump into a few questions, there's one more thing I'd like to address, and that is the morality of manipulation. I know what that nervous laughter is about, and this has been in the news quite a bit lately, which is, I think, fantastic. Because anytime we are changing people's behaviors to meet our ends, especially if those ends are corporate ends, we have to take a step back. This is a form of manipulation. And if we're not careful, it can be used for nefarious purposes, because the products that we're building, these are the kind of things that people take to bed with them every night. It's the first thing we reach for in the morning before we even say hello to our loved ones. So we have to be very conscious of our responsibility of how we use these products for good. And I believe if we're smart about this, we can fix so many of the world's products and services. You know, the goal here, the crowd that I'm preaching to, are not the game makers and the people who are trying to get people to do things that are big fat time wasters. I want to talk to the people who are helping people improve their lives by forming these healthy habits. And let me show you one example. A few years ago, I got a phone call by a guy named Glenn Moriarty. Every week, I do an hour of office hour in 15-minute increments for people who are starting out and maybe haven't raised funding, so they give me a call. And you can sign up too, by the way, if you ever want to chat. You can just go to my website. It says schedule time with me. So Glenn calls me up a few years ago, and he says, look, I'm a psychotherapist, and I know that there are way too many people who can't get the help they need from me. He says, in my neighborhood, I have people suffering from PTSD. I have people suffering from depression. I have parents who have children with disabilities and they just need someone to talk to. And going to get help is just too darn hard. So he built this service. It's called 7 Cups. 7 Cups gives psychotherapy services to anyone for free. And here's their hook. Let me walk you through their 4 steps. The internal trigger is feeling down, seeking connection, the need to pick up the phone and talk to another person. For no money, the action phase is to simply open this app, and the variable reward is to connect with another human being who is ready and able to help you. Now, the investment phase, and here's where it gets really interesting. The investment phase is the more you use a product like 7 Cups, the more you're taught how to become a trained listener yourself. And what they found is that people who form this healthy habit of being listened and then convert into someone who is offering help to others gets dramatically better. In fact, this free service is as effective as traditional psychotherapy. This one app services 800,000 sessions a week in 140 languages. Talk about the amazing power of using habits for good. And with that, I encourage you to build the change you wish to see in the world by using these habits for good. Thank you very much.